Um, you know, I was fascinated by this story for a lot of reasons. One of which is that my first job working in digital news was for CompuServe back in the late 90s. And the most popular thing they did was true crime forums. People just obsessed for hours over trying to solve cases and come up with clues. So it seems like sort of ironic or inevitable in a way that Stefan is brought down by some true crime aficionados who have nothing but time on their hands.
Well, you were smart enough to figure that out, that, the true crime audience is coming to the table with incredible enthusiasm, you know, dedication, like nonstop energy, you and this kind of, yeah, obsessive dedication. But what's really interesting is that Stéphane Bourgoin, even after his years, immersed in this industry and in this genre, really underestimated, I think, the intelligence of his audience. I mean, he went on shows, he went on podcasts, went on the radio and told these whoppers for years, and somehow didn't think that the people who were watching and who were listening, who were like, you know, really attuned to details, through what they had learned in true crime fandom, like thinking they weren't going to notice. And so I think it's very interesting that you picked up on that, and that wasn't something that was in the forefront of. Maybe it was. I don't know what was in his mind, but I do think that Bourgoin failed to give true crime fans their due in thinking that you know they wouldn't catch on.
Well, one of the things I liked in the third episode, there's this section where, you see these people talking about the personal price they paid, their obsession of solving this case. Relationships with spouses and kids and stuff went sideways, and yet they would do it again, which is an interesting dichotomy, that they have this compulsion to be, as the documentary says, part of the story.
Definitely, but I think part of what um, part of what we're exploring in this documentary is human behavior and human behavior at extremes. So, you know, a lot of, I mean, in talking about true crime, like a lot of people ask the question, like, why do you think true crime is such a phenomenon? Why is there such a, craze for true crime right now? And my thought on that is that these are kind of, very primordial and consistent human curiosities, really. The craze, the the you hear a lot about the contemporary phenomenon of true crime, but I don't think it is a new obsession. And I think you can look to the Bible, and I think you can look to, you know, all kinds of sources for people having been interested in these kinds of stories for a very long time. I feel like maybe I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but
That's okay. Well, one of the things I thought was interesting, particularly coming from someone who interviews people for a living, is there was this moment where you were talking about how you had thought, well, I'm going to be able to sit down with Stefan and get the answer. You're going to be able to solve this thing, and realizing that's not going to happen. It seems like that's sort of the overarching story of this, is that everyone wants to be able to tie these things up in a nice bow. Hey, I've solved it. And you know what? In true crime, that generally doesn't happen.
yeah, you're right. That is frustrating. Wouldn't it be nice to have all the answers and, just tie up all the loose ends and know exactly what happened when, and above all, why,
Yeah.
which was really like the big question mark that I never felt like I could quite put the dot on. I mean, I have plenty of ideas, I have plenty of theories, but Bourgoin was never able to tell me really, like, why he did this, why a person would do a thing like this, and why he chose to do it. And I think, maybe that comes from him not knowing the answers to those questions himself.
I mean, that certainly was the impression I had, was that, on some level he did these things almost not impulsively, but viscerally, this sort of, okay, I'm going to say this because it's a good thing to say without really thinking about it. And at one point, in response to one of your questions, he says something along the lines of, I don't know why I did it. And it seemed, in a sad way, really probably honest, that he, at this point, still
Right.
doesn't know quite why he did things.
Well, that's an interesting, I mean, you put your finger on an interesting paradox that some of the most honest, some of the most honest moments might be some of the least illuminating.
You know, you spent a lot of time with this story, and I'm curious what was it like when you got to a certain point and thought, okay, I know all the stuff about this I'm probably going to know. And there's still so many questions, not just motivation, but other things that he told, that it's just impossible to figure out what the truth was, or whether this person or this event happened at all. I mean, as a journalist, that's got to be pretty frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like started out trying to make these kind of neat timelines and
Yeah.
tables. And at a certain point, I realized, I mean, this is just not like a horizontal story. You cannot, it could not be confined to a timeline. The thing was like jumping out in all directions and sprouting upside down staircases and just looked like an MC Escher drawing. The more I tried to just control the timeline and the in any neat way. But I think like I did spend enough time with it. I mean, I've lived and breathed this story for, I think we're talking years, not
Yeah.
months. And that did ultimately give me the confidence to go in and, you know, um, to go in and challenge Bourgoin and really try to talk to him about um, what was behind all this, first of all. But I think it also inspired us at a certain point to start engaging with the questions that I think make this series really unique. And those are these kind of, larger scale, more macro and kind of meta questions um, about true crime as an industry, as a genre, as a way of telling stories. I mean, what I really love about this story is that it's a true crime story about true crime. And so it has these two levels. I mean, it has the story of Bourgoin and what he did in the who's and when's and where's, but then there's another more kind of qualitative level that we were also really interested in, which is the how's and why's. And so that was part of the appeal of this story is it just let us start grappling. It was a good way into grappling with some of those larger questions.
Why do you think that he ultimately kept talking to you? Because he could have just shut up after the stories broke, and the story would have went away. This documentary probably would have never happened. Is it ego? Is it a desire that, yeah, on some level he believes he's right and he wants to get that across? Did you ever get a sense of his motivation?
I think I asked that question when we talked, and I said, "Do you think this is going to help you sell more books?" I mean, I was trying to
Yeah.
figure out if it was, there's kind of the mercenary, motivation, but I don't think it's that ultimately. I think he has a compulsive desire to be in the spotlight, to be a character, to be a protagonist. And again, I was talking about the meta nature of this story. I mean, um, he's someone, who's given a lot of thought to how storytelling works. And I think that, I think he still wants to be a part of the story.
I'm curious, as a journalist. I went through an experience in the last year or so where I was in a documentary and from the other side being interviewed, and it really gave me a different perspective of journalism and what the process was like, and what the publicity was like, and just, it was a very odd experience. And I'm curious, what's your reaction to this? You're on the other side as well now, and having to do the press and talk about your work in sort of the abstract.
It's very unusual having the tables turned, isn't it? Wait, can I ask you now? Like, I'm actually really curious to what did you make of that experience? I'll answer
I-
your question, but I'm curious to know.
it was an odd situation. I had written a bunch of pieces that had gotten sort of ignored, and then when it was part of the documentary, suddenly people sort of just quote discovered the stuff,
Yeah.
and being interviewed because the thing was everywhere, and I'm sure this will be the experience with you. People in the oddest places will come up to you and say, "I saw you in that documentary." And okay, it's not
Yeah.
quite stardom, but it's a very odd experience to be recognized. I'm sure you go that as a journalist, no matter how much great work you're doing. Generally speaking, people don't stop you in a store and say, "Hey, I just saw you on TV."
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, if I'm being totally honest, I was a little bit reluctant about yeah, being on the screen. I mean, showing my,
Yeah.
usually like I'm a print journalist and this is the first time I've done this, but um the reason I wanted to do it is because of this idea that I was talking about earlier. We wanted to do this really, I mean, first of all, this is such a unique story in that Bourgoin took the entire repertoire of true crime and played almost all of the roles, right? Like investigator, media, victim, advocate. I mean, I think there were more, but he was kind of this like one man show. And so we wanted to do this really kind of like 360 look at true crime. And I think we thought that, trying to do a 360 look, but really making it like 350
Yeah.
wasn't going to make sense. We really wanted to like show our faces, show ourselves, interrogate the choices that we were making, like the role that we are playing. Um, and yeah, so I thought it was important for that reason.
Now, I guess let
Like
me.
we wanted to turn the mirror on ourselves a little bit, and it would be difficult to do that without like, kind of exposing myself to the same scrutiny and exposure that we were asking everybody else to take on and being a part of this.
Well, the documentary certainly has a couple of moments where a producer will sort of chime in and ask a question in the middle of an interview, or it, definitely seems like trying to push you a little bit outside of your comfort zone, which is interesting to watch as a viewer.
Yeah, I mean that's all, that was all, it's all part of the plan. Thank you for noticing.
Now, has Stefan seen this? Do you know?
Um, I'm not sure actually. I don't know.
I
But we
mean,
could I mean, we can certainly get you the answer to the question. I just personally don't know.
okay. And I know I need to wrap this up. Let me, as a journalist, you're in the middle of this, but also it's a situation of this is a really high profile story. It was really high profile when the prep piece came out. This is a documentary. Then I'm sure in the back of your mind you go, okay, what do I do now? I mean,
Mhm.
all journalists I think are fairly competitive, and sort of how do you get past that and just not really concentrate on this is the level of success this story got, and it makes you chase things that maybe aren't as important. Does that make sense? There's all this weird combination of ego and with journalism and wanting to tell a story, and this really skews everything a little bit with just all the publicity and all the attention.
I don't know that I don't know that I feel that pressure. I
That's good.
First of all, I mean, but part of it is also that well, you know, like I'm covering France for the
Yeah,
New Yorker in my job. And so right now um I'm in the midst of reporting a piece about the disarray, about the political disarray that
right.
France finds itself in. So, I mean, that definitely is not going to make a thrilling documentary for anyone. It's a very kind of like a lot of parliamentary procedure and, obscure constitutional kind of mandates. But yeah, I don't know. I it it's interesting. It's really interesting to talk to other journalists about this. And um, I don't know, each story to me just like always seems like its own thing that you live for a while and then I don't know, it's always on to the next one, right?
Well, hopefully anyway. Hopefully you don't have to deal with this guy again. I have a feeling it took a lot out of you. So
Well, we'll see. But yeah, it's like I don't know. This story has been in my life for for quite a while now.
one last question. I'll let you go. You mentioned, covering France. Watching this, it struck me that in some ways his rise to popularity could only happen in some place like France. If it was in the UK even, there would have
Mm.
been enough attention early on that someone would have jumped up and said, "Hey, that doesn't sound right." But in France, because it's a little smaller of a media market, it's a little more insular, he could get away with
Well,
it for a
and
lot
there's the
longer.
language barrier
Yeah.
above all. I mean, yeah, that this is a question that we have asked ourselves all along, and I'm not sure we ever definitively were able to answer even for our own purposes. But like one of the big questions for me has always been, did he just, find himself in the right place in the right time and kind of exploit the circumstances, or was this all part of his, cunning plan? And it's hard to know. I mean, you're right. He was able to get away like with a lot of stuff. I mean, had he been in the UK, okay, he would have had the kind of like decency shield of
Yeah.
people just not wanting to probe too much about the gruesome murder of someone's wife, but there wouldn't have been the language barrier. There wouldn't have been, he was also like very adept at kind of identifying new cultural, you know, trends and kind of moments that were happening in the US mostly, but in English speaking countries. I mean, also in South Africa, for instance, with Mickey Pistorius. And then like just importing them and translating them and passing them off on as his own in France. So you're totally right about that. I mean, what's interesting is when the Fourth Eye first got involved in this, they thought that they were effectively unmasking a literary crime. They thought it was
Mm.
like plagiarism because he was just taking chunks of things people had written and then like recycling them in French. And yeah, that was like it was very easy to get away with for a long time.
Well, I have to admit that watching this, I wondered if there was a an equivalent guy in Slovenia who's waiting to be unmasked or whatever.
Maybe that's your next door. Like, no, but you're right that it could work. I mean, um, it took a very long time before anybody caught on. And I do think the language barrier was a huge part of that.
Well, it was a really interesting story, and I liked the way that all the story it was all interwoven together. It wasn't just a straight recitation, as you said, of what was going on. It was a really great job. I'm glad that I had a chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to ask these really interesting questions and just to trade notes on journalism. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so